Welcome, everybody. I'm Roger Williams. I welcome you to History Author Talks, and I'm glad that you're joining us this evening. We've got a real treat for you in store. I wanted to let everybody know, first right off the jump, that as we listen to our guest speaker tonight, we welcome questions, and you can just use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, and those questions will come into me, and I will ask our guest questions. So we're doing something a little bit different. As most of my regulars know, we normally do nonfiction, but tonight we're going to welcome my friend David Stewart, who has written the first in a saga, which I'll explain in just a minute. David Stewart, after many years as a trial and appellate lawyer, David became a best-selling author of history and historical fiction. Wall Street Journal called his recent biography on George Washington, Political Rise of America's Founding Father, an outstanding biography with writing that is clear and often superlative. He's also written books on James Madison, Aaron Burr. He's won the Washington Writing Award for Best Book, the History Prize from the Society of Cincinnati, and the Prescott Award from the National Society of Colonial Dames of America. He wrote a series of novels before he turned to his new saga. Full disclosure, I'm actually the publisher of the Overstreet Saga, which you're going to hear about tonight. And I will also say just a couple of things. First of all, I kind of read you the canned bio, but if you haven't read David's books, you really need to go pick them up. Summer of '87 I think should be required reading for every high school student. His biography of George Washington is, as the Wall Street Journal pointed out, is superlative. I mean, I think it's really the best single volume biography of George Washington that's out there. And, the thing is, it's interesting, good historians tell clear history and make it relevant. A good novelist uses the language to draw you into the characters and paint a tapestry and weave a tapestry of life that makes you feel like you're there. David Stewart is both a good historian and a good novelist. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce you to my friend, David O. Stewart. So I'm going to add him to the screen here. David, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I feel like we should just cut it off right there. I'm only going to undermine whatever impression these people have made formed of me. But I do want to say one quick thing, as well as thank you for those kind words. It would be grand if some of you folks would be willing to actually turn on your cameras, like my good friend Marianne Keefe has done, so we can see you. It actually is a better experience if I see you. I know when you're bored. I know if you think I'm being funny or not. And so it's a kindness. Thank you.
Well, that's great. That's a great idea. Thanks for asking everyone to do that. Doing these Zoom talks, my regulars know that I actually started these Zoom talks because being a literary agent and a publisher, I had a lot of frustrated authors who didn't know what to do when COVID started. And this experience with History Author Talks has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed it. We get to talk with each other, and we get to see people from all over the country. So so before we start talking about the Overstreet Saga, David, I think it would be great if we just chat a little bit and talk to people about how you went from lawyering to writing. Tell us sort of that transition from
Oh,
when you first started writing. I think it's a neat story.
well, I did practice law a long time, 30 years, and I really liked it. In fact, at some level, I loved it until I didn't. I was just hit a point where I was done. And I thought I needed a chapter two. And I told my wife, gee, I think I'd like to write a book. And she suggested I go take a course on how you write a book, which was a pretty good idea. And I had an idea and tried to write fiction, and I wasn't too good at it. So ultimately, I did that first book, Summer 1787, you mentioned. And that has been just a great blessing to me. I like to think, continue to work on my craft, get better. And now I have done both a good deal, 5 historical books, and we're going to have 6 novels out. So it's been a great chapter 2. I've been really pleased and lucky.
That's terrific. And you've had the unfortunate experience of releasing your last work of nonfiction just as COVID got up and running, your biography of George Washington. But you have had an opportunity to speak to some groups, but there's still a lot of life left in that book. When is it? It's still in hardcover. Is it scheduled for paperback or?
Yeah, it comes out in paperback next month. And one of the things I'm finding is some of the places that we're sort of running in circles. That, it launched in February of last year when people didn't know what the heck was going on. And now some of those places are actually having me back, which is unusual for a paperback launch, but they just, are decent folks, and, they think the book is worth a shot. So I'll be doing a bit with the National Archives and with Politics and Prose, which is sort of the central bookstore here in DC. So that's been an unusual opportunity.
Well, at the risk of sounding like an aggressive bookseller, I encourage everybody. This is a book you want on your shelf, and it's worth the hardcover to have this piece of American history. Washington is on everybody's dollar, and you can really. It's more than just reading. With David's books, it's more than just reading history. You're really you're getting great storytelling. So I encourage everyone to get that one. So let's turn to the New Land and the Overstreet Saga. You wrote 3 novels prior to this series: the Paris Deception, the Babe Ruth Deception, and the
Lincoln.
the Lincoln. I'm sorry, yeah, the Lincoln Deception, of course. And then I guess the spirit moved you, and you came up with this new idea for a new series. And this is unlike the 3 previous novels, which were sort of about different periods of time. While these are different periods of time, tell us the nexus for this idea. Where did the idea for the Overstreet series come from?
Well, at some level, these stories have been in my head for, more than 60 years. The stories are inspired by my mother's family. She was a great storyteller. And like most great storytellers, she was not real hung up on facts. So I learned pretty early that I needed to check things. When we were kids, she would always tell stories about us that we would know weren't true. So we understood that she had an Irish approach to history. I got hooked initially with her because she claimed that she had this ring. And I was a kid who loved history, and I read the encyclopedia. I was just as boring then as I am now. And she claimed that the ring had been taken off the dead body of an ancestor on a Civil War battlefield. And, it's just an overwhelmingly romantic, wonderful, powerful story. Here was this Union Army guy trying to save the nation, trying to free the slaves, makes the ultimate sacrifice. And there, right in my dining room, is the ring taken off his finger. Well, of course, the story is not true. I discovered ultimately that, well, first of all, I got older and I realized that it was a girl's ring. This was not a ring any man would wear. But also, the fellow who was involved, who actually did serve in the Union Army, he was in a regiment out of Maine, wasn't killed. He did die, and he claimed he died. His surviving family claimed he died of his war wounds, but it was 8 years after the war ended. And he was terribly wounded. He was hit, according to the official records, with a cannonball in the side, which just sounds bad. I can't imagine anything good coming out of that. So I got interested in the family, and I have a lot of other ancestors, a lot of Irish. My father's family was Jewish. I knew my grandparents who were immigrants. But this little sliver of the family has been here since the middle of the 18th century. And their history, tracks the country's history. And that was always interesting to me. I would sort of peck at it as we went through life. And I found, she told me they were from Maine. And I discovered the records up there of the family. It's an unusual name. So there's a family story that anybody named Overlock is related to us, which is clearly not true. But it is not a common name. And, I unearthed some more inaccuracies from my mother. She claimed that the family was French and they were clearly German. The first guy who came over was Johann Gottfried Überlach. It doesn't sound very French. I just kept picking at it, and I thought I might be able to write a book about these people, and I discovered I was never going to get enough facts about them. They were not great people in the sense of, leading the country or, writing great American novels. They were just regular folks who lived through some terrible times. And it seemed like that's a way to look at our history that would be really interesting to me. I've written books on James Madison and the Constitutional Convention and George Washington and, the big guys and the leaders. And let's take another view. What was really happening? What was life like? I love historical fiction. I read it a lot. And I like it for that reason, that you see real people in a way that you can't in history. I don't know what George Washington was thinking any moment in time. He writes a letter, and the first question I ask when I see his letter is, did he mean it? Because people write things they don't mean. But when you're doing fiction, you can get inside the character's head. So it was an opportunity. So I was able to figure out a way to capture these ancestors in these three critical times. First is the founding era, when they come over as immigrants. Then the Civil War is book 2, and World War II is book 3.
So let's talk about the new land in specifics here. The first part, as you said, was they're emigrating from Germany. Hesse to be specific. The Overstreets are on the Marianne, and they are sailing from Europe to the coast of what is today Maine, is then Massachusetts. And you paint this picture of what it was like being on the ship. What kind of research did you do for that? Or is that just pure imagination? How did you capture the smells and the sounds and it's just amazing.
Well, I've read a lot of Patrick O'Brian novels,
Okay.
so that was a start. And I'm not a nautical person in particular, but that passage is one I've read about a good deal. And I actually dredged up a nonfiction account. It's from a few years later. It's at, I think, the 1820s or 1830s, but it's a pretty famous book, 2 years before the mast, written by Richard Dana, I believe. And I read the classic comic version of it when I was 8. And I thought, geez, I probably ought to look at the real thing. And he had a lot of interesting descriptions of it. I also did research on what the immigrant experience was like, because it's always worse. I mean, the crew has a terrible time, but certainly the cargo, and immigrants are just cargo, has a hard time. And that was really interesting to imagine and to try to put together. Luckily, I wasn't trying to describe a crew member or get the jib sail or the mainsail rider. I didn't fool with any of that stuff. But the experience of being on the ocean was something that I could get a sense of.
So and in the creative mind, I mean, not only do you have the opportunity to imagine what the sounds and the weather, but you also create these characters. I mean, and in your case, these are characters who are pseudo ancestors. Tell me the process of how Johann and Christianne Oberstreet came to be.
Well, it starts with Johann. He's the person I could get a little information about. And, I knew his age. I knew that he had a wife and some kids. And the key thing for me was he was described as a soldier of the high troops. So that gave me something to work with. He was a soldier. Germans from Hesse who went into the military generally were poor. You didn't become a soldier if you had any money. I mean, you might become an officer, but certainly not just a regular old soldier. And he left. He wasn't an old man when he left. He was, in his mid-30s. So he made the decision to turn his back on his career, which was an honorable career in Hesse. And that was sort of how I started to get into his mind, or my character, or create the character, the notion that here's a man who's been trained as a soldier. He's fought as a soldier. He was in his mid-30s. He'd done it for a while. He knew what he was doing, and he was done with it. And that opened a lot of doors for me. Then, the decision to come over here, it is my experience, and I'll just be blunt about it, that family decisions are often driven by the female and not the male in the family. That just is, and it's not by decree, it's by suggestion, careful presentation of options, and that we don't want female characters to be doormats. That feels wrong, and that was not my experience in my family. Hasn't been my experience in my marriage. But at the same time, you have to recognize that it's the 18th century, and women are not, they don't have the same rights that men do. And they have to, and I use the term, probably I shouldn't, they have to be a bit crafty and a bit indirect. And I thought that was an interesting dynamic to introduce. Johann's a straight ahead guy. He's got a military attitude. And Christianne doesn't ever take him on, but she's very good at making him understand what she thinks is a good idea. So that was an interesting dynamic to figure out.
Well, and it really holds up. I mean, through their relationship in the book, I can say. One of our members of our audience has asked what is probably the elephant in the room when it comes to historical fiction, and this is a great question, and I meant to get to it anyway. Charles McMillan asks the question, how do I know this fiction is plausible to the truth? I like nonfiction, and that I believe truths we use to make books. So before you answer the question, I want to just put my own 2 cents in here. I am, as a public historian myself, I am very critical of historical fiction, particularly in the eras for which I am familiar, and British America and the Revolution and the early Republic, I'm very familiar because I've read an awful lot in history. And and I get very, very impatient with historical fiction. I want to learn something, and I don't want to feel as though I'm in some sort of surreal situation. I will say to Charles, and then I would like to hear your answer to his question, that when being a fan of David's, I was always, it took me a little while to pick up his fiction. I'm not a huge historical fiction reader, insofar as I get very impatient, as I was just saying. Well, I loved his earlier books because I learned so much, and I know David as a historian, I was confident. So part of the answer coming from me, Charles, is that know who your author is. That's number one. But number two, what I found myself doing with David's books is that I would read a chapter and then I would go read the history. And I found just how much in sync they were. So I was learning about the history. So with that, David, I'll hand it over to you. How do you manage this craft of making up stories but making it real?
Well, I view the history as essential, but what I'll be honest, I really like about it is it's sort of guardrails for me. I sort of know where the country is going. I know where this community is going. And I do a lot of research. This is an era I know. I've written several books about it, but also, I need to find out specific things. I needed to find out about German immigrants. I needed to find out about Waldoboro, Maine, which is where they land. God help me, I found a 2-volume history of Waldoboro, Maine, which was extraordinarily good. Waldoboro is a postage stamp. It is a small town. I don't know how this guy found enough to write 2 volumes on, but I am totally indebted to him because he really dug into the community. He was from the community. I mean, nobody else could do that story, but it was a great source. And, you know, I've always followed the adage for historical fiction that you have to respect the facts we know. I know there's alternative histories people like to dream up, you know, what if the South won the Civil War, but that's not my thing. And the adage I always follow is, you can make up a lot, but Lincoln has to be tall. You just can't change the things that we all know. And so, you know, there's one historical figure, there's a couple of historical figures, but there's one people might know something about, who I didn't know much about, which is General James Wolfe, the great hero in the French and Indian War, because the guys from Maine end up fighting with him, alongside him during the war. And I had to do a lot of research about Wolfe, and it wasn't that easy. He's not a giant figure in history, but it turned out he was very interesting and fairly eccentric, which is always fun. So I needed to be sure I was portraying him fairly, because, you know, if it turned out he was tall, skinny, and red-haired and not very good looking, if I had made him a short, swarthy, you know, lady killer, you would have the wrong idea, and it would not be, I would be, you know, cheating. So those are things that I try to pay a lot of attention to. I went up to Waldoboro 4 times just to sort of walk around, get a sense for the layout, what the land was like. I get a lot of feeling for a place, and the place was important in this story. There's a, you know, there's the Battle of Bunker Hill, so I went to Bunker Hill. There's the Siege of Louisburg up in Nova Scotia, so we went to Nova Scotia. My wife is very nice. She went on all these trips. That, you know, it's no single thing I can ever point to that I get out of a trip, but it is a sense of the place, which is very important to me, and I hope comes through in the books.
Well, and to get even more specific about this, Charles and everybody else, when David writes about the siege of Louisburg, you know, I've read about the siege. I know about the French and Indian War, but I didn't know about the Massachusetts Rangers that were with Wolfe. That was something that had escaped me. Of course, I knew that there were provincial regiments that fought with the British, but this specific unit that fought at the siege, not only did I learn more about of course, they were Massachusetts then, not Maine, so it was a Massachusetts Ranger, the Massachusetts Rangers, who fought alongside the British Grenadiers. But so not only did I learn about the regiment, but David even got where they attacked, you know, where near the city, the landscape where they attacked, because when I finished reading the chapter about the attack, I went back and I started reading about the siege and about this, the nonfiction works that I have on the siege of Louisburg, and where the American Rangers attacked and where their approach was from. So that made the scene even that much more real. So I applaud you with that, David. I thought it was great. So this is what makes historical fiction great. And not only that, you've got the, you know, emotions of the men and the excitement of the battle. And so I thought that was really, really terrific. Let's take a step back a little earlier in the book, though. Obviously, what these immigrants had to deal with in setting up their town is that they're right near the bay, and today I live in suburbia, and I go and I learned at a very young age growing up in Vermont, the best place to find the deer is on the edge of the woods. That's where the deer hang out. Well, in reading your work, it's not deer that's on the edge of the woods, but it's Indians, you know. And tell me about the research that you did about how um, these colonists dealt with the indigenous tribes that were here before they were. And
Yeah, there was a lot of trouble with the tribes. They were unhappy with the settlements. And, Maine was settled late. So it's coming to a head in the 1740s and 1750s. There is a lot of conflict, and the French are stirring up a lot of it. They have much better relationships with the tribes. The tribes are smart enough to realize that the French aren't actually moving in and taking land. The British are the ones who are land crazy. So they more often ally with the French. And, the coast of Maine is frontier. It is a bloody frontier. And the settlers are just, I don't mean to be flip, but they're just hicks from Germany. I mean, these are farm people. They don't know anything about these, fighting Indians. They don't know anything about living with Indians. They could be, from another planet as far as these German folks are concerned. And the fellow who developed this settlement, who owned the land and brought them over, is sort of the villain of the piece. And every story needs a villain. And this guy's a pretty good villain. He started out in life as a slave trader. His name was Samuel Waldo. And he broke a lot of promises he had made to the settlers. He didn't give them the support that they were expected. And they spent years when they could not actually live on their land. They had to live in compounds, because if they lived on their lands, the Indians would pick them off. The Indians were incredibly skilled raiders. They were just so much better in the woods. They lived in the woods. They'd grown up in the woods than any European. And so the Germans were stuck just huddling together for safety. As I said, in Waldoboro, it was almost 4 years that they had to do that, and they hated it. So that is, a hard time, and they're not there trying to understand their brown brothers, and I don't mean to be flip about it, but they think they've been brought over to land. And that's what most German immigrants came for in the 18th century. They weren't coming for religious freedom. They weren't coming for political freedom. They were coming to make their lives better, and they thought they would do it with land. Now, they didn't quite reckon on the fact that they were getting land that was not very good farmland. They'd been lied to about that. And so they got to Maine and discovered that actually only the fishermen and the guys cutting down the trees could make a living. So they had to pivot, to use a 21st century term, and figure out other ways to go ahead. And they wanted to live in peace with the Indians. They managed to after a while, but it was a very bloody time at the beginning.
so you mentioned that they didn't come for religious freedom, but they were a religious people. And
that's something that I had to adjust to. They think of the world in biblical terms. They are religious, and we are a pretty secular society these days. That was every day for them. They had religion in their minds. And I've realized, going back over the book, I did insert it a lot. And I think that's fair. It may strike a modern sensibility a bit off, but I think that's what their lives were like.
Yeah, no, I found that interesting, because you there it was a part of the character, each character, and how they interacted not only with each other, but how they interacted with death, um, and the concept of family came a lot from their religious beliefs, for sure. One of the scenes in New Land that I found almost comical. It it's a cinematic scene for sure. Was they food was scarce, especially in the cooler months, in the colder months, but food was scarce, and obviously there were a lot of fishermen up in Maine, and but they didn't have a lot of weapons to go bring down a lot of game. But there was this wonderful scene where they heard from the locals that there were these creatures down in on the shore line that had a very that were very sweet meat. Tell us about the of what that scene was like, going down to the seashore and the rocks and the women finding these creatures.
Well, I did find some sources, particularly this 2-volume treatment I talked about, that talked about how, of course, the natural world was much more abundant because we hadn't used up all the resources yet. And one of the things that was amazing in some parts of Maine was, the lobsters were everywhere, and they were just, you sort of couldn't avoid them. And, you didn't have to go out and trap them. So that seemed like it might be fun because they're odd little creatures. They're sort of scary looking, but they can't do too much damage. And it struck me a couple things. One was that it was the sort of thing that would be logical for women to do. The women had to do a lot. They worked very hard, but there was generally a division of responsibilities. And the men went off in the woods and tried to trap or hunt or raise crops. But women took a hand, and so it struck me that they would be intrigued by this and just find out about this new place they're living in that they can't quite figure out. And the descriptions of what the lobsters were like, it wouldn't take a very sophisticated weapon to capture them. So I had to basically hunting lobsters with rocks, and it was intended to be somewhat comical. And so I'm glad you didn't find some tragic scene comical. And it is, there's a lot of tragedy in the experience of immigration. We see it today with immigrants who come to this country. I mean, it's always hard. And for that generation, people paid with their lives. It wasn't just hardship. And I had to write about that, and it was hard. So to find lighter moments is a pleasure, and I think the readers appreciate it a bit too.
No, it was great fun. Which leads me to the next conversation. The women in the New Land are their roles are so much obviously a part of society, but what they had to endure with trying to raise these children, but they also had their share of the hard labor um, in terms of making sure that the community survived. What, in doing your research, I mean, we, you know, in modern society, we all appreciate what, you know, what our partners do for us. But in your research, what did you find most dramatic in terms of the women of these early settlements, in terms of the work that they had to do? And
Well, I mean, the work was heavy, and the women died. No reason to beat around the bush. The number of men who married twice or three times just because their wife died is amazing. I realized when I was working on the George Washington book that infant mortality was a big problem back then. We always think of that, but actually parent mortality was a big problem. And you had a lot of blended families where there's a guy who's lost his wife and a woman who's lost her husband, and they get together. The most critical thing to me, and it shouldn't have been a revelation, but it sort of was just how terrifying childbirth was. And women died. I mean, it was often what took them away. And every time they were going to have a baby, they were looking at that risk.
and they had a lot of babies.
It wasn't a lot of birth control devices at the time. So if you were married, you were probably going to get pregnant. So it was, I think, an important revelation, which probably shouldn't have been one, but to bring home to readers as well. And I wanted to just, the lead character, of course, is Johann, but I actually found I enjoyed writing about his wife more. She felt more rounded, more accessible. And she was, he went off and fought enemies and put his life at risk. And she never left the house, and she fought enemies and had her life at risk too. And that was, I think that's something we need to appreciate about.
Well, just reading the character is empowering. I mean, just the character that you've developed gives me a better understanding of early settlement women. I mean, just this is what's wonderful about fiction, because because of your research, you were able to really sort of paint a picture of not only what they did, but how they felt and what they'd say and how they interacted with each other. And that's what I found fascinating about the dialogue that you managed to put historical fact in just day-to-day people. It's really quite something.
Yeah, writing dialogue is for me a lot of fun. And what's fascinating about it is you don't have to say everything. And this is where my legal experience is slightly helpful. If you ever look at a transcript of two people talking, it's terrible. You can't make any sense out of it. The pronouns have no antecedents. What are they referring to? Because they're gesturing, because it's context, because they know each other, they can communicate without saying every single word. And you want to be clear in fiction, but you also have that freedom. And you can engage the reader, because I find fiction readers are really good at understanding and thinking about and figuring out what's happening. Whereas a real nonfiction reader, if I don't tell them something happened, it didn't happen. They just don't believe it. They're not extrapolating. And that's the deal. My deal is I'm going to tell you what happened. But in fiction, I can leave it a little more ambiguous. I can imply things that people will pick up on. And I think it's a much more active form of reading sometimes. And it does engage the imagination, certainly my imagination, but also I hope the reader's imaginations.
So the structure of the new land is, I may have alluded to this, some of this earlier, but I want to, there's a reason why I want to bring it up again, and that is that we first meet the Oberstrasses as they travel across the ocean and settle in the new land. And then it jumps ahead a few years where the settlement has grown a bit, and we're now in the heart of the French and Indian War. Then the part 3 of the book jumps ahead from the French and Indian War all the way up to 1775. David, I want you to go back and I want you to write all those chapters that I missed, because I didn't feel cheated, but I felt wanting, because new children were born, new families emerged, new businesses emerged. It was fascinating. And I'm curious, are there files somewhere sitting on your computer of chapters that were written and not included in the book?
No. That's a hard no. It is I mean, I was talking about the book on Sunday with a group, an SAR group, and some lady was giving me a hard time. She wanted something at the end of the book. She wanted to know what happened. Why didn't I keep writing? And,
right.
I had to say, well, there comes a point where I just feel like I've told the story I want to tell.
Yeah.
And you have to balance it. I don't want to write War and Peace. So there's so many things you could, plot twists you could follow and try to get it. But some of it, to be honest, would be boring. And that's the thing. Ordinary life can be interesting for a while, but not that long. Unless you've got some amazing internal conflicts going on. So, it's just a gut thing. When you're putting a book together, fiction or nonfiction, you realize at some point, pace is the most important thing that pulls readers through a book. And after, you have a hard driving chapter, maybe a quiet chapter would be the right answer now. Let's take things down a peg or two, but you don't want to do that too much, because they may want to go watch Yellowstone on TV. So you want to put something in that's more exciting. So you're always working on how am I going to keep this story moving? How am I going to keep the characters engaging? And how do I get these folks to care? And it does involve some skipping, and there are things you just can't say. And this one lady who she wanted to know how something turned out, and I said, well, how do you think it turned out?
Exactly. I agree to a certain extent with your woman from the at the SAR meeting, because I started to get toward the end of the book, and I thought, wait a minute, there aren't enough chapters here for me to find out what's going on. And when I got to the end, I thought, okay, well, now I'm just going to have to sort of pick up and make up the story. I have to tell you that as David knows, my wife is also an author, and she's written 27 books, and most of them were fiction. And she used to tell me that she would be writing at the computer, and there were times when she would get so tired and she would fall asleep while she was writing, but the story kept going in her head. She kept thinking about the story almost in a dreamlike state. And that's kind of what happened to me. You know, when I put the book down after part one of The New Land, and I started to realize, okay, well, there's going to be a whole period of time that I'm going to miss here. I started coming up with my own vision of, you know, what some of these characters were doing. So in part three of The New Land, we jumped to 1775. And of course, many who are in this audience are always aficionados and students of the American Revolution. And because I want people to go out and buy The New Land, we're not going to give up a lot of what happened in the part three, because people are going to have to go read it. It's just amazing. I will just say, the one thing that I will say is the idea of what you have done is you made me feel like I was at the Battle of Bunker Hill. I was behind that redoubt, and I heard that screaming. I felt the heat of what was going on. And I think that you did an absolutely magnificent job in portraying, and I'm not going to give up the name of the character, but what this young man went through, both before, you know, why he went there and why he was there, why he behaved the way he did at Bunker Hill, and what happened afterwards. And I think it was just an amazing twist at how you did it. So we have a question here from one in the audience that I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, but she asks the question about why aren't there more books about our fiction, about our history? What's the magic here? I know you didn't sit down and think you were going to be a millionaire from writing this book. What was it that drove you to write about this? And what should we do as historians? And I'm a public historian. What do we need to do to get the word out to our fellow citizens that this is all worth reading? And why are we reading these books of history, of American history? Why are we reading fiction, American history?
Yeah. I mean, it is a great question, and you touched on it in the beginning, which is both what you might call straight history and also historical fiction. It's all storytelling. You know, when you are dealing with nonfiction, you got to pick the episodes you want to talk about, the anecdotes you're going to use. And it's the same. A friend of mine who does both says that the question is always, when you're sitting at the keyboard, is what happens next? And in nonfiction, you got to figure it out. And in fiction, you got to dream it up. The question, why do you do it as fiction, is really because you can get into the human part of it so much better. It's always a frustration. You know, I'll be reading some letter by George Washington and think, you know, geez, why didn't you just tell me what you were really thinking? You know, he's very formal a lot of the time. And you want to understand people's motives and their feelings and experience what they are experiencing. And that's what you don't, that's what's so hard to do. With nonfiction, frankly, there are a few writers who give it to you because they're lying, because they're writing fiction when they shouldn't be. I won't name any names, but be careful out there.
We know who they are, right? Exactly.
Well, I hope so. But the fact is, when you do fiction, you can enter the silences. There's a very poignant moment in Washington's life when his stepdaughter is 15 years old. She's been terribly sick all her life with epilepsy, and she just dies at the dinner table. And he writes a letter to a brother-in-law about it, and it's clear that he's just torn up about it, but he's kind of formal. And I can't do much more with that. But that kind of episode in fiction, you can explore those feelings. And you have told the reader, I'm making this up. I don't know. But this is what I think a person would feel. And it's, I think, very engaging for readers, and it helps them begin to be curious. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of the interest in history is just curiosity, where did we come from? How was this community formed? How did we develop? And it's a chance to dig into the silences. Frankly, even a big figure like George Washington, most of his life to us is silence. I don't know what he was doing at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in 1758. But as a fiction writer, I can make an educated guess, and I can put it in a context where it will tell you something about George Washington that if I just wrote a paragraph about, how he used to plant his tobacco plants, your eyes might glaze over. But if I can portray him doing it and trying to figure out how to get his foreman to, motivate the slaves better, that might be a much more interesting read for you. So it's I write both because I love both. And I do think there are some great historical fiction writers out there. They haven't clustered it in the American Revolution period. You find so much has been done about World War II. But, something like Shara's book, Killer Angels and the Civil War, the book about Thomas Cromwell, name of it escapes me right now, in England, was a wonderful book.
Mm-hmm.
No, Wolf Hall was a great book.
Right.
There are, they're out there. It just may not always be for the moment in time you wanted to read about.
As many in this audience know, I am a member of the Sons of the American Revolution. And one of the things that I always love doing when I go to the SAR meetings is to go around the table and we all talk about the stories of our ancestors. And you have done that in abandon. And I applaud you for the new land. I'm going to give everybody let's see if I can find it here. Give everybody a sneak peek at the cover of the Burning Land, which is the next book that is coming out in May. And this is also about the Overstreet family. So that's the front and back cover of the new book that's about during the Civil War. So I look forward to that book coming out too. And I want to thank you, David, for joining us. This show is being taped. This program is being taped and will be at History Author Talks. I'm having my Alexa is talking to me there. Next week, we've got Don Haggist, managing editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, who's written these distinguished corps, the British Grenadiers and the Light Infantry battalions in the American Revolution. Then we have Larry Kidder coming up on February 15th, The Revolutionary World of a Free Black Man. You can find David's books at historyauthortalks.com. I have a link to the bookshop where you can purchase his books with proceeds benefiting the SAR Research Library. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening.
I need to shout out to my old college classmate, Carrie Fowler. Hi, Carrie.
That's great. So I thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you all after the next round of playoff games. Go Chiefs, Brooks. I know that we had some great playoff games last weekend, and we should have some good ones this weekend. So I'll see you on the next episode of History Author Talks. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Roger.
You bet. Bye.